So at this point, I'm just practicing so I can get to a place where I can say to someone, this is what it's all about, this is what I'm trying to do, etc. So I'm going to put some classical music on. Hopefully it'll be quiet enough that I can still hear myself.
U.S. Bank Smart checking safe.
So, what I think the easiest way of explaining it is kind of the same way that I explained to this guy Owen. He's actually the reason that I'm making this is because he's the first person that I told that actually seemed to be excited about this idea, and the way that I got to talking to him about it was he asked me if I was going to do anything that day. I said, yeah, I'm going to write. And he said, well, what are you going to write? Are you going to write like short stories or what is it? And I was like, well, I'm going to write a constitution actually. And he's like, well, that sounds kind of interesting. Like what? What is it about? And I was like, well, have you ever noticed that every government that we have nowadays, you can't consent to it? There's no way to consent. And he thought about it for a second, and then he's like, yeah, I guess you're right. He just said, yeah. And I was like, well, then I thought, but voting is consensual, right? But it isn't, because the minority always gets its consent violated by the majority. So instead of democracy, what we should do is we should just move to places that have the laws that we want already in place. And then, say, for example, Colorado legalized pot, but Nebraska didn't. So if we were voting, then Nebraska would make pot illegal and then impose its will on all of us. And if we were the majority, we would make pot legal and impose our will upon all of them. So either way, somebody's losing when we do it that way when we vote. But if we just move, like let's say we don't want pot anymore, okay, well then we could just move to Nebraska. And he thought that was kind of funny because of Texas. He's like, I'm sure Texas would love that. And I thought that was funny too, because Texas probably would, because they'd probably secede and be like, ha, we're our own state now. We don't need you, federal government. Which I would applaud, honestly. But, because I fucking hate the federal government. To be perfectly frank, I think the federal government's a goddamn joke, and it's a parasite that lives on everybody and doesn't really do anything except try to perpetuate the deep state's oligarchic reign, indefinitely. So I really don't like the federal government. It seems to be a vehicle for the oligarchy to, do whatever it wants and do it with impunity and do it for free because they're doing it off taxpayer money, which they steal from us, which again is not consensual. So I'm trying to get to a place where I can say what the point of the whole movement is in the simplest way and also the most engaging way. And I think that was probably a good way to start, was to show that consent is the point. That's the sticking point, is our movement has consent. No one else's does. No other government on earth works now with the consent of its population in mind. It either violates it outright through some oligarchic regime, like a dictatorship, or it violates it indirectly by pitting one part of the population, the majority, against the other part of the population, the minority. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with racial lines. It sometimes does, but mostly it's class lines, rich people versus poor people, or it's political, Democrat versus Republican. But it can also be racial, white versus black, or whatever. And so there's a whole bunch of division in all of these. And so not only is there not any consent, but there's also not any integration. All these nations are just divided, and most people don't really care about their nation. I don't hear anybody like super patriotic, USA, USA. It's like the days of that are gone, because nowadays people have woken up to the tragic fact that America is just a corporation. All it does is just try to make more money. It doesn't stand for anything. It's just trying to make money. It's just like any other corporation. So people don't really have any respect for it anymore, because they've seen so much corruption that they're like, I don't care what the government says. I don't care what the nation's image is. We're not really nationalist anymore. We're almost anti-nationalist, if anything. So I think that on the left, I think most people would agree with me about consent. And I think on the right, they might agree more about the integration. But it's still the same problem, and it's still the same solution, which is that we don't pit people against each other in some adversarial way, because like not even nature really does that. Nature only resorts to conflict when there's no other real option. Conflict causes a lot of damage, and it's risky, and there's already enough problems for animals or living beings in general. Their environments are difficult enough, just surviving, starvation, dehydration, overheat, exhaustion, things like that. Those are already enemies enough. They don't really need to add another one to it. So they don't go out and pick fights just to do it. They only fight when they're defending themselves from death. Even predators only do that. They're not going to expend the energy to go kill something for fun, because they might not get the kill and they'll still have expended the calories. They can't afford to do that. So it isn't adversarial in any other system except for the ones that we as humans have built so far in civilizations. Is adversarial division, divisive systems. And they don't work. They just disintegrate. They fall apart. They fall to pieces. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with my system is also to make it as sustainable as possible, that it can last theoretically forever. But, it can only do that if it doesn't have this issue with violating people's consent usually through majority rule, but also through, like I said, dictatorships or other oligarchies. States is what I would say. And there is an anarchist type of flair to it, to the movement, because of the fact that a state is it's a parasite that controls its population, such that the population does what the government says rather than the government doing what the population says. The people, the population, end up being dependent upon the government for military protection, healthcare services, educational services, transportation services, all the infrastructure that the government pays for, the systemization of the commerce, because without the state, natively all we have is bartering and, beasts of burden. We don't really have much in the way of being able to build like tractors and stuff like that out of raw materials. The Industrial Revolution has made it so that the government basically can make people dependent upon it so long as it's industrious, just enough to be above what we would have if we were just hanging out in the natural, habitat that we've always been in before civilization. as long as the government does better than that, people won't resort to just going out and living in nature. But, it's getting to a point where the government's going to start being able to make us stay within certain areas, especially with this thing that they've started to do about national forests and national parks and stuff like that. And they're basically just closing everything off. They're trying to close the walls in. And eventually they're going to make it like North Korea, where you can't go anywhere without severe restrictions and severe tracking and surveillance and control, all of that. And we've been gradually headed towards that for a long time, but the pace is rapidly increasing. I can see the tempo is increasing. And I would bet that within my lifetime, if I don't escape this system, it's going to swallow everyone inside of it. And then there won't ever be an escape. And it'll be literally 1984. And that was my original terror. That was my original horror, fear, and nightmares, that it would all end up like 1984. I didn't so much see Brave New World as being the issue, unhinged capitalism taking over, because I just thought that was too free. There's no way the government would ever let us be that free. It's going to be more like 1984, unless we get out of it, which is the point of the movement. So inherent to that, it's always been anarchistic, and that anarchism is a rejection of statehood as being necessary. Statehood being where the population is dependent upon the government, but the government is not liable to the population. The government doesn't necessarily change according to what the population does. However, the other problem with the government is that it's gotten lazy, and now all it does, and it may always have done this, is to just parasitically feed off of the very population that is depending upon it by taxing it. And not just taxing sales, not just taxing luxury goods, but taxing literally everything that you could possibly think of taxing. We get taxed so much that you can't exchange money without some form of taxation hitting you. There's no way to exchange anything without there being a baked-in extra cost, because when you sell it, you have to pay sales tax. When you buy something, you have to pay sales tax. When you make any income, you have to pay income tax. You're going to pay property tax if you're going to have any property that's developed on any kind of governmentally owned land. You're going to have to pay property taxes. You can't homestead, that's illegal, so they've already gotten rid of that option. And like I said, the walls are slowly closing in. So then I started to think, well, what about if they are illegitimate like that, then why can't I just steal the land and just develop it however I want and refuse to pay property taxes and stuff like that? And the reason is because their arbitration is equally valid as my own arbitration. Just because I arbitrarily decide that what they're doing is illegitimate is just as equally valid and equally invalid as them saying it about me. So, or my movement, or the movement, whatever. So, it's anarchist because I don't believe that government is necessary. I don't believe that statehood is necessary. I think the problem with statehood is centralization. When you centralize, you cause problems because the population isn't directly involved. And as soon as they aren't directly involved, then they become dependent upon the state, and the state then makes the decisions for the population, because now the population isn't free enough, independent enough to be able to make the government do whatever they say. So it is still anarchistic, because I don't consider any of the government structures or governance structures that I have to be centralized or independent of their populations. All the governmental structures that I've put into the Constitution are all directly dependent upon the population actions of those particular areas. So there are no government officials There are no politicians. The only thing that there is, this is the part that is the catch, because there's always a catch. There's no politicians, but there is surveillance. There is a mass surveillance system. And the reason for that is because I don't want crime, but also because I have to ensure that everyone is free. So the surveillance makes it so that they can just track who is doing what, and then that will ensure that each place is given its particular legal jurisdiction, that it will say, well, at least 66% of the population act in this particular way. So there is still a majority, but the difference is that once those rules get established by the majority, and this is just normative actions, there's no paperwork that gets filed, so there can't be any corruption there. It's very simple. It's very seamless. All that happens is that people will automatically review the surveillance footage, and they'll just notate, okay, this person has committed this act. And that's part of this larger pattern of people also committing this act in this area. So therefore, the act is then legal. But nobody stamps it like that. They just do the legwork of identifying which acts have and have not been committed in which areas. And when that becomes documented, then it becomes the norm, and then it becomes the law, and then it just perpetuates until or unless people start acting in mass differently, at which point then the law will reflect that. But it only ever reflects what people are actually doing. And I think that that's not only better for the government because there's less bureaucracy, but also because it simplifies the process, it makes it more efficient, which also then makes it a lot easier to see, so that the average layperson is the one that's going through the surveillance footage and identifying what the act actually is that's being committed, rather than whether or not it should be found guilty or innocent. There is none of that. All that happens is that the acts themselves get identified. If those identified acts are deviant or aberrant in relation to the area that they're being committed in, the norm of that area, then they are illegal. And then that person gets a bounty put on their head just automatically because they've committed an act that was outside the norm of that area. So then somebody can randomly pick up that person and deposit them at the brick and receive their bounty. And they don't have to even be a certified bounty hunter. But if anybody brings them to the brick, then they get that bounty. So it then makes it so that there's no need for the structure, the centralized police force, for example, the centralized everything. It's all decentralized in my system. And the decentralization of it, I think, is what makes it so efficient as well as fair, because you've got so many different people looking at the same thing, all of whom are independent. They're not even in the same room, so they can't influence each other's opinions. They're all separated from each other, and yet they all reach, or not all of them, but the majority of them are going to reach the same conclusion. If they don't, then it'll just go up a level until it does. And by going up a level, it's either going to ask more people, or it's going to ask people that typically can resolve these or have resolved these disputes in the past, namely experts. And by doing that, then the whole system will have it's almost like a mind where all of the thinking is automated, and the only thing that humans have to do is identify what things are and what they aren't. And as soon as they identify what it is, then everything after that is just automated. And really, that's what decision making is this identification. As soon as you identify what something is, typically you're going to have a box that you're going to put that in. And then depending on which box it goes in, you're going to treat it a certain way. And that's going to then have certain consequences. So by the time that you've already identified what something is, the rest of it is all automatic. Why shouldn't that just be automated if it's going to be automatic? So the only thing that the population is doing is identifying things. And the government, quote unquote, is just a series of those algorithms where it just checks, okay, what is the norm? What is the statistically majority norm set of all those normative acts, where at least 66% of the population within any contiguous area, all as a majority, commit this act, then it's legal. If they don't commit the act, then it's illegal. And that's as simple as it gets, man. It's very simple. So there's something about that I don't think is readily apparent to people if I say it, but I feel like if they saw it, then they would immediately understand what I'm trying to get at, which is it would be the first time where the people own the government rather than the government owning the people. And not only that, but the taxes are extremely limited. The only tax that I think should be allowed are sin taxes, which is a necessity because they are if left unchecked, divisive, disintegrating force on society, which is illicit, drugs, sex, and violence. And those three things, so like illicit violence would be like hit jobs, mafia stuff, go break this guy's legs, whatever it is. Sex would obviously be prostitution, and then drugs, recreational narcotics. Those three vices are a strain on society, and they don't really benefit society, and they hurt it. So, okay, I can legitimize a tax there because the government has to then step in and create rehabs for these people to go and do those things. Either behavioral rehabilitation if they're a sex offender or an addict or a gangster, then they'll have to go through behavioral rehab so that they can, operate like a normal person. That's going to cost money, and it's going to take resources. And so there has to be taxes to pay for that, irregardless. And then I say, why don't we just up the ante a little bit more and not only have it pay for all that, but also everything else? And then we just make shit that is a vice really expensive, but not so expensive that it becomes, impossible to get. Well, not impossible, but there's always going to be a black market. The black market is inversely proportional to the expense of, the cheapness of products. The cheaper the products are, the smaller the black market is. The more expensive they are, the bigger the black market is. And if it gets too big, then it becomes more legitimate than the government. And that's when there's an issue. But it's always going to be there. So yes, there will be a black market, and the only reason that it will exist is because it's cheaper, but it's also of poorer quality, and it's more unreliable, and it's difficult to get, and it's even more difficult to keep because people are going to constantly get busted, or they're going to be doing drugs themselves, or they're going to get into some crazy drama. So as long as the government doesn't get too carried away with making things too expensive, the black market tends to just implode on itself. But the trick is to just not give it a big enough margin to operate with any logistical efficiency. It should never be able to compete with legal markets. So economically, the consent problem is in the fact that I have to sell myself as if I'm a product to somebody who then hires me, which I find extremely dehumanizing because I have to fake everything and just try my ass off to look like the model citizen. But it's bullshit. It's like asking somebody why they want to work somewhere. Well, they're going to work there so they can get a fucking paycheck. They're not working there because, of anything else. They need the damn money. Only if it's a special assignment, at which point it's going to speak for itself and they wouldn't bother asking you. Unless it was something like personal, but it's not going to make or break your interview process. So, I don't know. There's just stuff like that people get asked during interviews or that get screened out or in, depending on race and all kinds of unrelated bullshit. And so it violates my consent that way. I also don't have any access to the means of production, so I can't really even consent to working because the only way that I can access the labor is through using someone else's means of production, which puts them in a place where they're totally independent of me, and then I'm totally dependent on them, and then it's not really consent. It's just ownership. And so economically, the way that gets fixed is that through the sin taxes, the government collects enough money to be able to build reverse vending machines so that people can deposit whatever the vending machines are selling, some commodity, and in exchange they get paid. And the magic of that is that it's always consensual. You can always go to the machine anytime, day or night, as much or as little as you want, and always get treated fairly. Whether you're a man or a woman, black or white, you all get treated equally. So the reverse vending machine solves that problem, and the syndication that I was describing earlier, where everybody develops a normative set of acts, is the political side of it. And then the social side of it is the definition of consent, and then that gets applied to everyday situations so that you can understand if something is or isn't consensual.
Look at me, look what I'm doing. Yeah.